He invited his ex-wife to the reunion to remind everyone she was nothing. And for a moment, it worked. Emily stood there in a simple dress while Ryan smirked beside his perfect fiancée, his voice smooth as he said, "Some people never really move up." And the room quietly agreed, eyes filled with pity, until the doors opened and the entire atmosphere shifted as a black Rolls-Royce key was tossed to the valet and a man every person in that room recognized walked in, his gaze scanning once before, locking onto her, and suddenly the noise faded, the laughter died, and he crossed the floor like he owned not just the building but the moment itself, stopping in front of Emily, gently lifting her chin as if the world had been waiting for this exact second, and with a calm that shattered every assumption in the room, he said, "There you are, my queen." And just like that, Ryan's smile cracked. But he still had no idea what was coming next. He didn't invite her to remember the past, he invited her to prove she was nothing without him. The envelope had arrived 3 weeks earlier, thick ivory cardstock with Ryan Brooks' name embossed in gold, the kind of invitation that felt less like a reunion and more like a statement. And Emily Carter had stared at it for a long time on her small kitchen counter, the late afternoon sunlight cutting across the paper like a quiet warning, because she knew Ryan. She knew the way he curated moments, the way he turned rooms into stages and people into props, and she knew that if he wanted her there, it wasn't for nostalgia, it was for control. It always had been. Yet somehow, against every instinct that told her to throw it away, she had slipped on a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention, just something that felt like herself, and drove 30 miles out to the country club where the reunion was being held, her hands steady on the wheel even as her chest tightened with memories she thought she had buried years ago. And when she stepped inside, the air hit her first, cool and scented with polished wood and expensive perfume, the low hum of laughter bouncing off crystal chandeliers overhead, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt like she had stepped backward, in time into a version of her life that had never truly belonged to her. Eyes turned slowly, recognition flickering across faces that once knew her name, whispers threading through the room like quiet static. "Is that Emily? Ryan's ex?" And she could feel it, the subtle shift, the unspoken judgment, not loud, not cruel, just enough to remind her exactly where she used to stand in this world. And then she saw him, across the room, exactly where she expected he would be, at the center, Ryan Brooks, still wearing confidence like it was tailored just for him, his arm draped casually around a woman who looked like she had stepped straight out of a magazine, all polished edges and effortless perfection, his fiancée no doubt. And when his eyes found Emily, the corner of his mouth lifted, not in surprise, but in satisfaction, as if the evening had just begun exactly the way he planned. He guided his fiancée forward through the crowd, conversations parting for him like he owned the air between people, and when he stopped in front of Emily, the space around them tightened, the room leaning in without making it obvious. "Emily," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a memory he'd already rewritten. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." His gaze swept over her, slow, deliberate, not admiring, not curious, but measuring, and then he smiled, that same polished smile she used to mistake for warmth. "You look comfortable." The word landed softly, almost kind, but she knew better. She had heard that word before, in quieter rooms, in colder tones, and around them. A few people shifted, a few exchanged glances, a few small smiles appeared, the kind that weren't meant to hurt but did anyway. And Emily felt it, the old pressure, the weight of being seen and dismissed in the same breath. But she didn't shrink. She didn't correct him. She didn't reach for anything to defend herself. She simply met his gaze, calm, steady, as if his words had nowhere to land. And for the briefest second, something flickered in his expression, something uncertain, something he didn't quite recognize, but it passed quickly, replaced again by that easy confidence, because in his mind, the script was already written, the roles already assigned, and Emily Carter was still the same woman he had left behind, still standing exactly where he expected her to be, still unaware that tonight was not going to follow his version of the story at all. Ryan did not move away after that first exchange. Instead, he lingered just long enough for others to notice, just long enough to make Emily feel like she was standing in the center of something carefully orchestrated, and within minutes the circle around them began to form. Familiar faces drifting closer under the pretense of curiosity, old classmates with polished smiles and expensive watches, people who once shared lockers and laughter now measuring success in subtle glances and quiet comparisons, and Ryan, as always, knew exactly how to command that attention without ever raising his voice. "You remember Emily, right?" he said lightly, turning to a group beside him, his tone casual but deliberate, as if he were introducing a story instead of a person. "She used to be well. She always had a simpler taste." A few chuckles followed, soft, polite, the kind that tried to pass as harmless. But Emily could feel every one of them like a shift in the air pressure, and she noticed the way his fiancée tilted her head, studying her with that same composed curiosity, not openly rude, just quietly certain of her place in the hierarchy of the room. And for a moment the years folded in on themselves, the same dynamic, the same subtle positioning. Ryan elevating himself by gently lowering her, never enough to be called out, always enough to be felt, and Emily's fingers brushed the side of her glass, the cool condensation grounding her as memories surfaced uninvited. Late nights in their old apartment where she had tried to match his expectations, conversations where her ideas were dismissed with a smile, where the word comfortable had been used again and again until it lost all warmth and became something smaller, something limiting, and she realized that nothing about this moment was new. It was simply the same pattern dressed in a different room. And across from her, Ryan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel private while ensuring she could not ignore it. "I am glad you came," he said, his eyes sharp now, searching for a reaction. It takes confidence to show up when things did not exactly work out. The pause was intentional, the implication hanging between them, and Emily met his gaze without flinching, her expression calm, unreadable, which seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have, because he was used to responses, to emotion, to something he could shape. And around them the conversation shifted again, someone asking about his company, another complimenting his fiancée's ring, the spotlight returning to him as easily as it always had. Yet Emily remained there at the edge of it, present but untouched, and she became aware of the room in a different way now, not as a place she needed to belong, but as a stage she could observe, the flicker of insecurity behind certain smiles, the careful way people laughed at the right moments, the constant, quiet performance of status and approval. And for the first time, she did not feel smaller inside it. She felt separate from it, as if she had stepped outside of something that once defined her. And Ryan noticed, his eyes returning to her again, a faint crease forming between his brows. Because the woman standing in front of him was not reacting the way he had anticipated. She was not shrinking, not defending, not even leaving. She was simply there, steady, composed, and that steadiness disrupted the rhythm he relied on. "You always were quiet," he added, almost as if to fill the space. "Still are." And Emily allowed herself the smallest smile, not directed at him, not meant for anyone else. Just a quiet acknowledgement of something he still did not understand. And as the music shifted and the chandelier light glinted across the polished floor, there was a subtle change in the atmosphere, something unspoken, something waiting, like the moment before a door opens that no one in the room is expecting. And Ryan, for all his control, had no idea that the script he believed he was leading had already begun to slip out of his hands. The shift began so quietly that most people did not notice it at first. A subtle pause in the music, a slight change in the direction of attention near the entrance, but Emily felt it before she saw it, like a ripple moving through the room that had nothing to do with her, and yet was somehow pulling everything toward her. And then the doors opened, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to let in a different kind of presence, and conversations faltered mid-sentence as heads turned almost instinctively, because some people did not need introductions. Their arrival spoke for them, and the man who stepped inside carried that kind of weight, tall, composed, dressed in a way that did not demand attention yet commanded it completely, his movements unhurried, precise, as if time itself adjusted around him. And a valet hurried past with keys to a car no one needed to see to understand, and whispers began to move through the crowd in low, surprised tones, names exchanged under breaths, recognition spreading faster than anyone could control. and Ryan's voice, which had filled the space so effortlessly just moments ago, hesitated for the first time, his posture tightening ever so slightly as he followed the direction of everyone else's gaze, trying to place himself back at the center of a moment that was no longer his. And Emily remained still, her eyes lifting slowly toward the entrance, her heartbeat steady, not racing, not panicked, just aware, as if some part of her had already anticipated this turn without needing to understand it fully. And the man's gaze moved across the room once, calm, assessing, before it stopped, unmistakably, on her, and everything else seemed to fall away in that instant. The laughter, the music, the layered conversations dissolving into something distant and irrelevant, because the way he looked at her was not curious, not surprised, but certain, as if he had always known exactly where she would be. And he began to walk, not toward the crowd, not toward Ryan, but directly toward Emily, each step deliberate, closing the distance that no one else in the room would have dared to cross with that kind of confidence. And people shifted aside without being asked, space opening naturally in front of him, and Ryan felt it, the loss of control unfolding in real time, his hand tightening slightly at his side as his fiancée glanced between him and the approaching figure, uncertainty replacing the easy composure she had worn all evening. And when the man stopped in front of Emily, there was no introduction, no explanation offered to the room that now held its breath around them, just a quiet, undeniable presence standing inches from her. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching in a way that felt intentional, almost sacred. And then he reached out, his hand gentle as it lifted her chin just enough for her to meet his eyes fully, a gesture so natural it felt like it belonged to a history no one else could see. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying through the silence without effort. "There you are, my queen." And the words landed not like a declaration, but like a truth that had always existed, and the effect was immediate, visible, undeniable. The entire room shifting in a single breath, the same people who had looked at Emily with quiet judgment now frozen in disbelief, recalculating everything they thought they understood, and Ryan stood there, the confidence that had defined him slipping just enough to reveal something beneath it, something uncertain, something unprepared, because in all the versions of this night he had imagined, in every outcome he had carefully constructed, this moment had never existed. And Emily did not look at him, did not acknowledge the shift, did not claim the power that had just been placed beside her. She simply stood there, calm, composed, as if she had never been anything less than what she was now being called. And in that silence, in that stillness, the entire room understood something Ryan never had, that she had not returned to prove her worth. She had returned already knowing it. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled through the room. And the weight of those 3 words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, reshaping every glance, every assumption, every quiet judgment that had existed just minutes before. And Emily felt it without moving. The shift in how people looked at her, not with pity now, not with quiet dismissal, but with something far more fragile, something closer to realization. And beside her, the man did not rush to explain himself, did not turn to address the room or validate his presence. He simply remained there, steady, his attention still anchored on her, as if nothing else held importance. And that stillness carried more authority than any announcement could have. And Ryan, for the first time that evening, found himself outside the center of his own narrative, his voice catching before he spoke. "I am sorry," he began, forcing a small laugh that did not quite land. "I do not believe we have met," his tone attempting to reclaim control, to reframe the moment into something he could manage. But there was a faint tension beneath it now, something brittle, something uncertain, and the man's gaze shifted then, not hurried, not reactive, simply acknowledging Ryan's presence with a calm that made the distance between them feel immeasurable. "You have not," he replied evenly, his voice composed, unhurried, as if introductions were optional rather than necessary. And the room leaned in, again, waiting for a name, a title, something that could anchor what they were witnessing into something familiar. But instead, he turned his attention back to Emily, his hand still lightly holding hers, not possessive, not performative, just certain, and Emily felt the warmth of that contact, the quiet steadiness of it, and something within her settled fully into place. The last remnants of the tension she had carried into the room dissolving without effort, because for the first time that night, she was not reacting. She was simply present, and around them, whispers began to take shape, fragments of recognition connecting, someone near the bar murmuring a name under their breath, another person straightening slightly as realization dawned, and Ryan heard it too, the subtle shift in tone, the sudden recalculation in the room's energy, and his posture adjusted instinctively, as if trying to align himself with something he did not yet fully understand. "Well," he said, clearing his throat. Emily always did have a way of surprising people. The attempt at humor fell flat, his words no longer carrying the same effortless influence they had just minutes earlier, and Emily could see it now. The difference, the space between who he had been in her life and who he was in this moment. And it no longer felt intimidating. It felt distant, almost irrelevant, and she finally spoke, her voice calm, measured, not raised, not sharpened, just clear. "I did not come here to surprise anyone," she said, her gaze steady as it met his, and there was no anger in it, no need to defend or correct, only a quiet certainty that did not invite argument. And Ryan opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came, because the foundation he had built his confidence on in this room had shifted, and he could feel it slipping in ways he could not control, and the man beside her did not intervene, did not escalate. He simply stood there, his presence alone redefining the space Emily occupied, and that was enough, more than enough. And across the room, conversations began to resume, but softer now, more cautious, as if everyone was aware that something significant had just happened, and they were still trying to understand it. And Emily took a slow breath. The scent of polished wood and champagne no longer overwhelming, no longer tied to anything she needed to escape, and for the first time since she had stepped into that room, she felt completely untouched by it, as if she had moved beyond its reach without ever needing to leave. And Ryan, standing just a few feet away, realized in that quiet, irreversible moment that the version of her he thought he had invited back no longer existed at all. Emily did not pull her hand away, not because she needed the support, but because for the first time in a long while, she did not feel the need to retreat from a moment that once would have overwhelmed her, and the warmth of his presence beside her was not something that defined her. It simply existed alongside who she had already become, steady and unshaken. And across from her, Ryan shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that betrayed more than any words could, his confidence no longer effortless but carefully maintained, like something slipping beneath the surface he was trying to hold together. And his fiancée, who had once stood with quiet certainty, now watched the exchange with a different kind of attention, her expression no longer composed but searching, recalculating the balance of a room that had changed without warning, and the conversations that resumed around them carried a different tone now, softer, more cautious, the kind that followed when people realized they had misread something important, and Emily could feel the difference in every glance, the unspoken acknowledgement that the narrative they had accepted moments ago was no longer valid. And she let that realization settle without reacting to it, without claiming it, because it did not belong to this room. It belonged to her long before she walked back into it. And the man beside her finally released her hand, not abruptly, not as a withdrawal, but as a quiet gesture of trust, as if he knew she did not need anything more to stand exactly where she was. And he turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room with calm awareness, acknowledging the attention without engaging with it. And in that simple movement, it became clear that his presence was not about proving anything to anyone here. It was about recognizing her in a way that required no audience. And Ryan saw it too, the absence of performance, the lack of explanation. And it unsettled him more than any confrontation would have, because there was nothing for him to challenge, nothing to argue against, and he attempted once more to regain footing. "It is a small world," he said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You never know who people end up connected to." The sentence lingered, incomplete, as if he was waiting for clarification, for a detail that would allow him to reposition himself within the moment. But none came, and Emily met his gaze again, her expression unchanged, her voice calm when she finally spoke. Some things are not about where you end up, she said quietly. They are about who you become. And the words did not land like a challenge. They settled like a truth, simple and unshaken. And for a second, the space between them held that meaning without interruption, and Ryan had no response. Because for the first time, he understood that the version of her he had tried to define no longer existed in any form he could recognize. And that realization did not come with anger or regret. It came with something quieter, something heavier, the awareness that he had misjudged her completely. And Emily did not wait for anything else to unfold, did not stay to watch the aftermath or measure the impact. She simply turned, her movement unhurried, her posture relaxed, as if leaving was not an escape but a choice she had always been free to make. And the man beside her fell into step with ease, not leading, not following, just walking beside her, as if that had always been the only place he intended to be. And as they moved toward the exit, the room seemed to part again, not out of obligation but out of something closer to respect. And Emily did not look back, not at Ryan, not at the people who had once defined her place in this space, because there was nothing behind her that required acknowledgement anymore. And as the doors opened and the cool night air replaced the warmth of the ballroom, she stepped forward without hesitation, leaving behind a silence that lingered long after she was gone. A silence filled with the quiet understanding that everything Ryan had tried to control that night had slipped beyond his reach the moment she chose not to be who he expected her to be. The night air felt different the moment Emily stepped outside. Cooler, quieter, carrying none of the weight she had walked in with. And for a few seconds, she simply stood there on the wide stone steps of the country club, the distant sound of laughter and music now muted behind closed doors, as if that entire world had already begun to fade into something smaller, something less significant. And beside her, he did not rush to speak, did not fill the silence with explanations or questions. He allowed it to exist, steady and unbroken, giving her the space to feel the shift fully. And Emily exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she had been holding for years rather than minutes. Her shoulders relaxing as the tension that once lived quietly beneath her skin dissolved into something lighter, something freer. And she turned slightly toward him, studying his face in the soft glow of the exterior lights, the calm certainty in his expression, the absence of expectation. And it struck her then that nothing about this moment felt accidental, not his arrival, not his words, not the way he had looked at her as if he had always known exactly who she was. And yet there was no pressure in it, no demand for her to become anything more than what she already was. And that was what made it different from everything she had known before. And he met her gaze with the same quiet composure, a faint smile touching his expression, not triumphant, not performative, just present. "You handled that better than most people could," he said, his voice low, even as if he were stating something obvious rather than offering praise. And Emily let out a small breath that almost became a laugh, shaking her head slightly. "I used to think I had to prove something in rooms like that," she admitted, her voice softer now, more reflective than guarded. "Tonight, I realized, I do not." And the words settled between them with a kind of finality that felt earned, not forced. And he nodded once, as if that was exactly what he had expected her to understand. And for a moment they simply stood there, the quiet stretching comfortably, until the distant sound of a car engine approaching broke the stillness, headlights sweeping across the driveway as a sleek black car pulled to the front, the driver stepping out with quiet efficiency. And Emily glanced at it briefly before looking back at him, a question forming that she did not quite voice, and he seemed to understand it anyway. "I did not come there for them," he said calmly, his tone carrying the same quiet certainty as before. "I came because I knew you would be there." And there was no hesitation in the statement, no attempt to soften it, just a simple truth offered without expectation. And Emily felt something shift again, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a steady recognition that whatever this was, it was not built on performance or control. It was grounded in something far more solid. And she nodded slowly, accepting the moment without needing to define it. And as the driver opened the car door, he stepped slightly to the side, not guiding her, not directing her, simply allowing her to choose. And Emily paused for a second, looking back toward the building, the warm lights glowing through the tall windows, the silhouettes of people still moving inside, a world she had once believed she needed to belong to. And she realized there was nothing there calling her back anymore, nothing unfinished, nothing unresolved, and with a quiet certainty, she turned away from it completely, stepping forward toward what waited ahead without hesitation. And as she moved, he followed beside her, not leading, not claiming, just present in the same steady way he had been from the moment he walked into that room. And behind them, the doors remained closed, holding within them a version of her life that no longer had any power over who she had become. The car door closed with a soft, deliberate sound that seemed to seal the night behind her, and as the vehicle pulled away from the country club, the glow of its lights fading into the distance, Emily sat quietly in the back seat, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her reflection faintly visible in the tinted window as the world outside blurred into streaks of passing streetlights and shadowed trees. And for the first time in years, there was no tension in her chest, no lingering echo of words she wished she had said differently, no replaying of moments she wished she could change, only a calm, steady awareness that something had ended without needing a final confrontation. And beside her, he remained just as composed, his presence unobtrusive, yet unmistakable, as if he understood that silence was not emptiness but space for her to feel the full weight of what had just shifted in her life. And after a few minutes, she turned slightly toward him, her voice quiet but clear. "You knew what he was going to do tonight." It was not a question, and he did not deny it, his gaze meeting hers with the same calm certainty. "I knew the kind of man he is," he replied, and there was no judgment in his tone, only a simple acknowledgement. And Emily let that settle, realizing that the difference between knowing someone and being defined by them was something she had only just begun to understand. And the car slowed as it turned onto a quieter street, the city lights softening into something more distant, more private, and she glanced out the window again, watching as familiar patterns of her old life gave way to something new, something undefined. And she felt no urgency to name it, no need to control where it was leading, because, for the first time, the uncertainty did not feel like a threat. It felt like possibility, and she leaned back slightly against the seat, exhaling slowly. "I used to think strength meant staying," she said after a moment, her voice thoughtful, almost distant, "staying quiet, staying patient, staying in places that made me feel small." And the admission did not carry regret, only clarity, and he listened without interrupting, his attention steady, allowing her words to unfold at their own pace. "But tonight," she continued, her gaze shifting back to him, "I realized that leaving is not weakness, it is clarity." And there was something final in the way she said it, as if the realization had already rooted itself too deeply to be undone. And he nodded slightly, a faint acknowledgement that did not try to redefine her conclusion or add to it, because it did not need anything more. And the car came to a gentle stop in front of a quiet building, the engine idling softly as the driver stepped out, opening the door with practiced ease. And Emily paused for a brief moment before stepping out, the cool air brushing against her skin again. But this time it felt different, not like an escape, not like relief, but like arrival. And she stood there for a second, looking at the building in front of her, then back at him as he joined her on the sidewalk. And there was a question unspoken between them, not about who he was or what he represented, but about what came next. And for once, she did not feel the need to answer it immediately, because whatever came next was not something she had to earn. It was something she could choose. And as they stood there in the quiet of the night, far removed from the noise and expectations of the room she had left behind, Emily understood something with a clarity she had never felt before, that the power she had thought she lost had never truly belonged to anyone else. And the only difference now was that she finally knew it. And as she stepped forward toward the entrance, he moved beside her once more, not guiding her path, not defining it, just walking with her into a future that no longer needed permission from anyone she had left behind. The hallway was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if the building itself respected the stillness she carried with her. And Emily stepped inside slowly, the soft echo of her heels against polished floors marking each movement with a calm certainty that would have felt unfamiliar just hours ago, but now felt natural, earned. and the air inside was different from the country club. No heavy perfume, no layered conversations, just a faint scent of clean linen and wood that grounded her in something real, something that did not require performance. And she paused near the entrance, her fingers brushing lightly against the strap of her bag as she took in the space, not searching for anything, just noticing, present in a way she had not allowed herself to be in a long time. And behind her, he entered with the same quiet presence, closing the distance without disrupting the silence, his gaze moving briefly across the room before settling back on her, not assessing, not measuring, just there. And Emily turned slightly toward him, her expression thoughtful, as if she was still piecing together the full shape of the night. "You never told me your name," she said, her tone light but steady, not demanding, simply acknowledging something that had been left unspoken. And for the first time since the reunion, there was the faintest shift in his expression, something softer, almost amused, as if the detail had been intentionally delayed rather than forgotten. "Alexander Hale," he replied, his voice even, the name carrying weight without needing emphasis. And Emily recognized it, not immediately as a shock, but as a quiet confirmation of everything the room had hinted at, the whispers, the subtle shifts, the way people had reacted without fully understanding why. And she nodded once, not in awe, not in disbelief, just accepting the information as another piece of a larger picture that did not define her place in it. And Alexander watched her reaction carefully, not with expectation, but with interest, as if he understood that what mattered was not who he was, but how she chose to see herself in relation to him. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was deliberate, giving space for something unspoken to settle between them. And Emily let out a small breath, her shoulders easing as she moved further into the room, setting her bag down on a nearby table with a quiet sense of finality, as if she had just crossed an invisible line between who she had been and who she had allowed herself to become. And she turned back toward him, her gaze steady. "You called me your queen," she said, the words simple, without accusation or expectation, just a recognition of what had shifted everything in that room. And Alexander met her eyes without hesitation. "Because that is how you carried yourself," he answered, his tone calm, matter of fact, as if the truth did not need to be dressed in anything more elaborate. And Emily felt something settle deeper within her, not because of the words themselves, but because they reflected something she had already begun to understand before he ever spoke them. And she looked away briefly, her eyes tracing the quiet lines of the room, the absence of noise, the absence of pressure. And for the first time, she realized that what had changed was not the world around her, it was the way she stood within it. And when she looked back at him, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a quiet clarity that did not ask for validation. "Then I suppose I finally learned how to see myself," she said, her voice steady. And Alexander inclined his head slightly, a small acknowledgement that did not interrupt the moment. And outside, the city moved on as it always did, distant sounds of traffic and life continuing without pause. But inside, everything felt still, grounded, as if time had slowed just enough for her to recognize that this was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something she had reclaimed. And as she stood there, no longer defined by the room she had left behind or the man who once believed he could shape her place in the world, Emily understood that the power she carried was not given, not taken. It had always been hers, waiting for the moment she would finally choose to stand in it without apology. The quiet in the room did not feel empty. It felt intentional, like a pause placed between two chapters of the same story. And Emily moved slowly across the space, her fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair, as if grounding herself in something tangible, something real. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel it fully, the difference between who she had been inside that ballroom and who she was standing here now. Not because anything external had changed, but because something within her had finally settled into place. And behind her, Alexander remained near the doorway, not intruding, not observing in a way that demanded attention, but present in that same steady way that had defined every moment since he walked into her life. And she turned back toward him, her expression thoughtful, as if a question had been forming quietly beneath everything else. "Why tonight?" she asked, her voice calm but direct. "Why did you come there?" And the question carried no accusation, only curiosity, the kind that comes when the fear has already been replaced by clarity. And Alexander met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged. "Because I knew it mattered to you," he said simply, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he was not referring to the reunion itself, not to the room or the people or the past, but to the moment, the closure, the unseen weight she had carried into that space. And Emily felt that understanding settle into her, deeper than any explanation would have, and she looked away briefly, her eyes tracing the quiet lines of the room again, her thoughts moving through memories that no longer held the same power over her. The late nights where she had questioned her worth, the quiet compromises she had mistaken for strength, the way she had once measured herself against expectations that were never truly hers. And for the first time, those memories did not feel like something she needed to escape. They felt like something she had already outgrown, and she turned back to him, a small shift in her posture, not defensive, not uncertain, just open in a way that did not seek approval. "You did not need to say anything in that room," she said quietly. "You could have just walked in and everyone would have understood." And Alexander allowed a faint smile to touch his expression, something subtle, almost private. "It was not for them," he replied, his voice even. "It was for you." And the words landed with a clarity that did not require interpretation, because Emily understood immediately what he meant. Not that he had given her something, but that he had reflected something she had already begun to see within herself. And she exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization settling into something steady, something unshakable. And outside, the distant sound of the city continued, a reminder that life moved forward regardless of who was ready for it. But inside, time felt still in the best possible way, as if she had finally caught up to a version of herself she had been moving toward for years without realizing it. And she stepped closer, not out of hesitation, not out of need, but out of choice, standing beside him rather than across from him, her gaze steady as she spoke again. "Then I think I needed to hear it," she admitted, her voice calm. And Alexander nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had known that from the beginning. And the space between them felt different now, not defined by the moment they had shared in the ballroom, but by something quieter, something more grounded. And Emily realized that whatever came next did not need to be dramatic, did not need to be proven or declared. It could simply unfold, because for the first time, she was not stepping into it from a place of doubt. She was stepping into it from a place of certainty. And as she stood there, no longer carrying the weight of who she had been or the expectations of who she was supposed to be, Emily understood that the most powerful shift of the night had not been the words spoken in front of a crowd. It had been the quiet moment where she chose to finally believe them. The night did not end when the doors closed behind her. It unfolded quietly into something deeper, something that could not be undone by a single moment or defined by a single room. And Emily stood there in the stillness, aware now of how much of her life had been shaped by spaces like that ballroom, spaces where value was assigned by perception, where worth was negotiated through approval. And for years she had moved within those spaces carefully, adjusting herself, softening her voice, reshaping her presence to fit expectations that were never truly hers. And yet tonight, without raising her voice, without defending herself, she had stepped out of that pattern completely. And the realization settled into her with a quiet certainty that felt stronger than anything she could have said out loud. And Alexander watched her with the same composed attention, as if he understood that what mattered now was not what had happened, but what she chose to carry forward from it. And she moved toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass, the city lights stretching out beyond it in soft lines of gold and white, a world that no longer felt distant or intimidating, just open. And she rested her hand lightly against the cool surface, grounding herself in the present moment. "I thought tonight would feel like closure," she said after a moment, her voice thoughtful, "like something ending." And she paused, considering the weight of that expectation, before continuing, "But it does not feel like that." And Alexander stepped closer, not intruding, just near enough to share the space without taking it over. "Because nothing was taken from you tonight," he replied calmly. "You did not lose anything. You recognized what was already yours." And the distinction settled in her mind with clarity. because for so long she had framed her past as something that had been taken from her, her confidence, her sense of self, her place in the world. But standing here now, she understood that none of those things had truly disappeared. They had only been buried beneath expectations she had accepted without question, and she turned from the window to face him, her expression steady, no longer searching for confirmation, only acknowledging what she already knew. Then it was never about him, she said quietly, and Alexander inclined his head slightly, not correcting her, not expanding on it, because the truth did not need to be complicated. And Emily let out a slow breath, the last threads of that realization settling into something permanent, something that would not shift again under pressure or doubt, and she moved away from the window, her posture relaxed, her steps unhurried, as if she had nothing left to prove and nowhere she needed to rush toward, and the silence between them remained. But it was no longer the silence of uncertainty, it was the silence of understanding, the kind that did not demand to be filled. And outside, the distant hum of the city continued, steady and indifferent, a reminder that the world would move forward regardless of any single moment. But inside, something had changed in a way that would not be undone by time or circumstance, and Emily realized that the most significant part of the night had not been what Ryan had said or done. It had not even been the way the room had shifted. It had been the moment she chose not to respond the way she once would have. The moment she chose to stand without shrinking, without explaining, without seeking approval, and that choice, quiet and almost invisible to everyone else, had changed everything. And as she stood there, no longer defined by the past or the expectations she had once carried, Emily understood that what came next would not be shaped by what had happened to her, but by what she chose to build from this point forward. And for the first time, that future did not feel uncertain. It felt entirely her own. Morning arrived without urgency, the soft light filtering through the tall windows in slow, deliberate lines that stretched across the room, and Emily stood there with a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar only because she had spent so many years rushing past moments like this, measuring her worth by what needed to be done next rather than what had already been understood. And now, there was no rush, no pressure pressing against her thoughts. Only a calm awareness that something fundamental had shifted within her and would not return to what it once was. And she moved toward the window again, her reflection clearer now in the daylight, not softened by shadows or distance. And for a moment she studied it, not critically, not searching for flaws, but simply recognizing the person looking back at her as someone she finally understood. And behind her, the quiet presence of the room remained unchanged, but the weight she had once carried into every space was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that did not depend on who else was watching. And her phone, resting on the table nearby, lit up briefly with a series of notifications, messages that had begun arriving late into the night and continued into the morning, names she recognized, some familiar, some distant, all carrying variations of the same tone: surprise, curiosity, admiration. The sudden shift in how people saw her now that the narrative had changed, and Emily glanced at the screen for a second before turning away from it completely, because for the first time, those messages did not hold the same pull. They did not define anything she needed to understand about herself, and the silence that followed felt deliberate, like a choice rather than an absence. And she stepped away from the window, her movements unhurried, grounded, as if each action carried its own quiet certainty. And when Alexander entered the room, his presence as composed as it had been the night before, there was no disruption, no shift in atmosphere, only a continuation of something that had already been established. And he paused for a moment, observing her with the same calm attention, not evaluating, not questioning, just present. "You look different this morning," he said, his voice low, not as an observation meant to impress, but as a simple recognition of what had changed. And Emily allowed a faint smile to form, not in response to him, but in acknowledgement of the truth in his words. "I feel different," she replied, her tone steady, and there was no need to explain further, because the difference was not something that could be summarized. It was something that had settled into every part of her without announcement. And Alexander nodded once, accepting that answer without asking for more, because he understood that what had changed was not external. It was not tied to the events of the night or the reactions of the people who had witnessed it. It was internal, something that would remain long after the memory of the reunion faded, and Emily moved toward the table, picking up her phone for a brief moment before setting it back down again, as if confirming to herself that she no longer needed to engage with the noise it represented, and she turned back toward him, her posture relaxed, her gaze clear. "I used to think being seen was the goal," she said quietly, "but now I think being understood, even just by myself, matters more." And the statement did not carry doubt or hesitation. It settled into the space with quiet confidence. And Alexander's expression shifted slightly, not surprised, not impressed, but aligned with the realization she had reached. And outside, the city continued to move forward, unaware of the shift that had taken place within one person's life. And that was what made it real, because it did not need recognition. It did not need validation. It simply existed, steady and unshaken. And Emily understood that the power she had reclaimed was not something that could be taken again, not because of who stood beside her, but because of who she had chosen to become. And as the morning light continued to fill the room, she realized that this was not the aftermath of a moment. It was the beginning of a life she would no longer live on anyone else's terms by midday. The city had fully awakened, the distant hum of traffic rising into a steady rhythm that echoed faintly through the windows. And Emily stood in the center of the room with a sense of calm that no longer felt fragile, no longer felt new, but grounded, as if it had always been there waiting for her to stop searching for it somewhere else. And she moved with quiet intention, not rushing, not hesitating, simply choosing each step without the need to second-guess it. And the messages on her phone had continued to grow, more names appearing, more curiosity, more sudden interest from people who had once overlooked her. And this time she did pick it up, not out of impulse, but out of clarity, scrolling briefly through the notifications, reading enough to understand the pattern without letting it define anything. And she saw it clearly now, how quickly perception could change, how easily people adjusted their view of someone once the narrative shifted, and instead of feeling validated by it, she felt distant from it, as if she was observing something she no longer participated in. And she set the phone down again with a quiet finality, not rejecting it, not needing to, just choosing not to be pulled into it. And Alexander watched her from across the room, his expression unchanged, his presence steady. And there was something in the way he allowed her to move through these realizations without interruption that reinforced what she had already begun to understand, that none of this required direction, none of it needed to be guided. And she turned toward him, her posture relaxed, her voice clear. "It is strange," she said, "how quickly people decide who you are based on what they see." And Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the observation without diminishing it. "People recognize power when it is visible," he replied calmly. "But that does not mean it was not there before." And Emily let the words settle, not as something she needed to learn, but as something she already knew in a different form. And she walked toward the window again, the sunlight stronger now, casting sharper lines across the floor, illuminating everything without distortion. And she realized that clarity often felt like this. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just precise, impossible to ignore once it appeared. And she rested her hand lightly against the glass, her reflection meeting her gaze without hesitation, without doubt. And for the first time, there was no part of her that wanted to look away. And she spoke again, quieter now, more to herself than to him. "I used to think I needed someone to see me this way," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But I think I just needed to see it first." And the truth of that statement did not require confirmation. It settled fully on its own, and Alexander remained where he was, his presence unchanged, not stepping closer, not interrupting the moment, because he understood that what she had reached was not something that could be given. It was something that could only be recognized. And Emily turned from the window slowly, her movements unhurried, her gaze steady, and the room felt different now, not because anything in it had changed, but because she no longer carried anything into it that needed to be resolved. And she walked past the table where her phone rested without glancing at it again, without feeling the pull of it, because the version of herself that sought validation from it no longer existed. And she stopped near the center of the room, the light falling evenly around her. And for a moment, she simply stood there, not waiting, not anticipating, just present. And in that stillness, she understood that the most significant part of what had happened was not the way others now saw her. It was the way she would never again allow herself to be seen through a lens that diminished her. And that realization did not need to be defended or proven. It would show itself in every choice she made from this point forward, quiet, steady, and undeniable.